Hello, and welcome to the Justin Center podcast. I get to be your host today. I'm Lisa Cooper, and I'm here to interview Jordan about his new book, Union with Christ. So, I get to take over the podcast today. First thing to mention is that Justin Center is listener supported.
Yes.
So, you can check us out on Patreon. I'm sure you have all the links below, right?
Yeah, I do. JustinCenter.org. You can go to our donate page there. There are all different ways to donate, but you can do it through Patreon too, which is one of the links there. But you can just go to patreon.com/JustinCenter.
You can go and buy books.
Buy my new book.
From the publishing house. And that also helps.
Yeah. So thanks for doing this. I know we did this last time I released a book, and it just kind of made sense to do it the interview style. And a lot of people said a lot of positive things about it. So I think it's a fun thing to do every once in a while when I have a new book released. So
it's always fun to hear that you want me back on the podcast. Yeah. So that's fun.
People still want you back on to talk more about the women in ministry question. And
yes, eventually. So
maybe we'll do more on that.
Yeah.
It would be good.
We need to our kids are home over the summer, and we're both working from home, so it's challenging to get time.
Podcasts are difficult. I've been doing them at night, so
yeah. So it's very late while we're recording this, and our kids are asleep. So it's about how we could swing this.
It's a good excuse for me if I stop making sense. So
same, I guess.
Why don't we go ahead and we can talk about the book?
Yeah. There wasn't anything else I missed in the intro. We're good.
No, I think you're good.
Cool.
So this,
So this is Jordan's new book. It's called Union with Christ: Salvation is Participation. And it's part of the Contemporary Protestant Scholastic Theology series,
right?
That he's working on. But can you explain why it's out of order?
No, it's totally out of order.
Why?
I just felt like being like George Lucas, and putting the whole thing out without a numerical order. It basically when I started working on this particular volume, it wasn't part of this series because there was no vision for a series necessarily when I started writing this. I was writing my dissertation, which I knew would be very much connected to. We can talk a little bit about how that relates to this, but to this. And, after working on my dissertation, which is also published, you can pick up as the first book in this series, Prolegomena, a defense of the scholastic method.
It's over there.
I
pull that one. Sorry.
So that book was a defense essentially of scholasticism, and I thought initially it would be fun to then take that and branch off and say, okay, now that we've defended the method, let's develop it with regard to certain doctrines. Initially, I had a vision of like 4 books to do this, including that one. And I was also largely through writing this particular volume, and I realized how well it connected. And then I thought about the volumes that I had planned and came to the conclusion that I really needed more than just those extra 3 volumes to do, justice to what I really wanted to do. So the idea expanded to 9 books, and it may further expand, who knows. But that's at least what it is at this point.
So this is what, number 6?
This is volume 6. So
went 1 to 6.
1 to 6.
And then he'll fill in the gaps elsewhere. You're currently writing another volume in this series.
Well, right now I'm working on 2 separate volumes. So I'm working on volume 2 and volume 5. 3 and 4 are going to wait, I guess. So volume 2 is the Doctrine of God. So it's a defense of classical Trinitarian theism. That's like the subtitle. And the other is on justification. So the goal of this was to have the doctrine of salvation as applied in 2 separate volumes. One on salvation as forensic declaration, a volume on justification. This one is salvation as participation. So I'm essentially arguing for the validity of both of those methods of manners of speaking about salvation, is that there's a forensic element and a participatory element. So this is the participatory part. This is the part that's more maybe controversial within Lutheranism, and the forensic part is kind of the heart of Lutheran soteriology. So I didn't do that one first, but anyway, I'm going back and doing a volume on justification. So that has led to a series of volumes all coming out in not in order. These books, though, are written purposefully so that if you haven't read the other volumes, you can pick up just any one of them and get what's going on.
Yeah, that's one of the main questions I've seen from people on the internet.
Yeah.
Can I pick this one up if I haven't read Prolegomena, or if I haven't read Christification, another book that Jordan wrote. Look, I pulled this one, though. I remembered this one.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Because this deals with largely the same topic, but, like, if you look at the comparative size of these books, obviously Union with Christ goes much, much deeper. So, but people don't have to read this before
they don't.
Before they pick up.
And I've had questions about whether they have to read both books, either Christification or the Prolegomena. Christification, for those of you who aren't familiar with that particular work, it's one of my most popular for sure. That was my second book. It's a Lutheran approach to Theosis. And in that book, I take a look at the doctrine of union with Christ and the mystical union in the Lutheran tradition, and kind of do a little bit of a comparison between that and the Eastern Orthodox doctrine of Theosis, and ask kind of where do they agree, where do they disagree. And I do a little bit of a look in Scripture. So it's really comparative theology in relation to the Eastern Orthodox tradition, similar to how the book following that, The Great Divide, was a comparison between Lutheran and Reformed theology. And I've just kind of been interested in that, in comparative theology and comparing different traditions and how they approach topics and where we can find similarity and overlap and where we differ. So that was kind of what was behind Christification. When I wrote that volume, though, it was always my intention to write something more in depth on the issue. It was like, I want to formulate my thinking on this, like the basic thinking on this, and that book came out of that process. But it was a small volume, and it gives a very brief summary. It's like Theosis in Scripture, and Theosis in Eastern Orthodoxy, and then how that compares to Lutheranism, and
like the Church Fathers.
And the Church Fathers, but it's like little chapters on each, and knowing that I wanted to expand into something much more in depth, and this is the product of that.
Yeah, so do you want to give a little bit of background about how you even got on this topic? Because I feel like, well, I know the story. But, I think this may not be something that a lot of people know. Like, how did you get interested in the topic of union with Christ, and why?
Yeah, so there's...
It's not something that Lutherans are talking about all the time, so, like, why?
No, it's not. There are a couple of reasons why I've been interested in this for a long time. This basically is what I wanted my dissertation to be. And I ended up, maybe we could talk about that a little bit, but I ended up kind of switching my focus to theological method and philosophy, really. Because the question that I essentially came into that asking was, why was the doctrine of union with Christ lost in Lutheran theology? Because it was really prominent in earlier theology and it's not in later. And then I realized it was a philosophical shift, so I had to go back and do the groundwork there before I could even delve into the doctrine proper. So, brief summary there. But going back to the question, like, why did I address this issue in the first place? What was my interest? Coming from a Reformed background, union with Christ is like everything, right? I mean, it's the central reality of salvation applied. If you read someone like John Murray, or Redemption Accomplished and Applied, union with Christ is really that becomes kind of the schema under which all the other benefits of the Ordo Salutis are to be understood. So justification and sanctification, but even talking about things like predestination in light of union with Christ. So coming from a Reformed background and reading Lutheran sources, it naturally was going to be a question that I had. It was like, oh, what do these Lutheran guys have to say about this whole union with Christ thing? And I certainly noticed that in the older sources that I had read, it was there. I mean, if you read Chemnitz, he talks quite a bit about union with Christ, this idea of this mystical union. It wasn't there much in Pieper, if at all, in a couple of footnotes, and that's about it. But which is kind of the standard dogmatics text for most Lutheran seminaries. And I think the fact that that's used contributes to the loss of that doctrine. But when I started reading some of the older Lutheran theologians, I just noticed that, they do talk plenty about union with Christ. But then I also noticed when I started reading newer Lutheran theologians, they don't really talk about union with Christ. So it was kind of a question of like, because I'm thinking in my Reformed mindset, union, what's the Lutheran view of union? And going into the text, when I see Chemnitz, I'm like, okay, this is a Lutheran view of union. But then when I talk to Lutherans about union with Christ, pastors, and like, they have no clue what I'm even talking about. So, like, how did this get lost if this is a prominent part of Lutheran theology for such a long time, and that it's not? So that's kind of the background of why I was interested in the subject. Eventually, when I did my master's thesis on also published The Righteousness of One, an evaluation of early patristic soteriology in light of the new perspective on Paul. It's like a mouthful of a title. I don't know. But Salvation in the Church Fathers, right? That's what it's about. So in that book, it was someone at the school I was working at who had, urged me to look at the Finnish perspective on Luther, because what I was trying to do was say, what did the Church Fathers believe about salvation in Paul specifically? How did they read Paul? And how did they read Paul in light of what is now the new perspective on Paul and the new perspective on Paul's criticisms that Luther misread Paul? So do they see Paul's doctrine of justification in a similar way to Luther? Or do the Church Fathers diverge from that in different ways? And so in the midst of that, I was challenged, well, why don't you read a little bit on Luther with this Finnish school, because they deal with Luther and Theosis, and that's like a thing in the Church Fathers. I was like, okay, so I'll read that. So then that study began with an examination of Luther's theology of salvation, because to examine the Church Fathers, you first have to, and if I ask them the question, like, do they agree with Luther? I have to ask the question, well, what Luther are we talking about? Because there are many views of Luther, many approaches to Luther. Essentially, I came to the conclusion that the Finnish authors were correct, not in the entirety of their theology, but they were certainly correct in that Luther, especially in his Galatians commentary, his later Galatians commentary, really emphasized this intimate, they would say, ontological union with Christ. Like in faith, there is a bonding of the human person with Christ in some unique way. And that really is a key part of Luther's theology. Now, what the Finns want to do is grab onto that and make some connections with the idea of theosis, because they're involved in some dialogues with the Orthodox Church. But I was coming at this not from that perspective necessarily, but I was coming at it with just the question of like, okay, I've got to get Luther right and understand what my view of Luther is before I go to the Church Fathers. And that union with language stuck out to me so much. And in light of the reading I had done in Chemnitz and other things before, the pieces just kind of fell together. They kind of fell in place. And it wasn't through reading Eastern Orthodoxy. It was, eventually I did start reading Orthodox sources. And I know you wanted to ask me about that, so maybe I'm going beyond.
Oh, no, that's fine.
So
I'm just here to make you talk, right?
Yeah.
Like that's.
So I did get into some Orthodox sources. And there were a couple reasons for that. One was because I was reading the Finns. It was like, I should probably know more about Orthodoxy, because like that's what they're dealing with largely. Also, Lisa, you were at the time working a lot with Dostoevsky and ideas of theosis and Russian Orthodoxy and how that affected some of the themes in his writing.
Yeah, like my final paper in college was on that.
Yeah, and we had a lot of conversations about that because I thought it was very interesting, and we had talked about confession and theosis in Dostoevsky. And I had a friend who had recommended some Eastern Orthodox books on theosis to read. So I said, okay, I'll give that a read. And that's what led to Christification. Was I kind of already formulated these ideas of union with Christ within Lutheran sources, but then it was like, well, now I'm going to go into Eastern Orthodoxy and see like what is it that they have to say. And that's why I started reading a bunch of Orthodox sources on theosis. Yeah.
So I think one of the main misconceptions I see about how people kind of perceive your work who haven't read it, they say, well, you're just strong-arming theosis into Lutheranism. Or alternatively, you're wholly adopting an Eastern Orthodox approach. So I know we're going to get there more as we go, but just to start, does that hold any water?
No, I mean, I hear that criticism all the time, or I see it online, and it's, I don't know, has it ever been somebody who's actually read any of my material?
Well, that's the question.
is the question, because usually if you ask, they have not. No, they haven't. They hear the word theosis and they say, oh, that's bad, that's not Lutheran, that's to get rid of that.
So when you're using the word theosis, within the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there's a broad range of what that means, and that's kind of what you talk about in Christification.
Well, the thing is
that there's multifaceted different approaches.
Yeah, and something I brought out in that book when exploring the subject was that even Eastern Orthodox scholars largely recognize that there are a couple different strains of thinking in terms of what theosis means. And what you read in some of the fathers, like Irenaeus, for example, and Athanasius, probably the two greatest very early examples, but Cyril of Alexandria would be another one. Those particular individuals speak about an elevation of the human nature, a uniting of humanity with the divine through the incarnation of Christ, where the emphasis is redemptive historical, right? It's very Christological. The emphasis is on what Christ has accomplished in his life, that he has accomplished a union of humanity and God. And that's not to say that they don't see practical application to those things. So I'm not saying it's just purely, historical and theoretical or something. But that's really where it's rooted. And you see this other tradition coming out of Pseudo-Dionysius and, the divine names. And this is particularly prominent within certain strains of Orthodoxy, those influenced by Vladimir Lossky, which, he calls, his Dionysius' work the most important work for Orthodoxy, apart from Scripture. So this is certainly a very formative text. Now, it's true that within Eastern Orthodoxy, there's a bit of there's grabbing onto both of those strains of tradition, but a lot of the scholars, even from within the tradition, recognize that these are two different strains. So what I'm arguing essentially is that or what I was arguing in Christification, is that first strain is very much what certain Lutherans were getting at. Those who, like Martin Chemnitz was drawing on these same fathers, and so does C.F.W. Walthers, and so does Johann Gerhard, and they quote those fathers talking about theosis. They quote it approvingly. They agree with what's going on. They especially quote those fathers when they're speaking about Christology, because a Lutheran Christology actually really lends itself to a form of theosis, very much so, more than the Reformed, certainly. So the argument in that book, as I began to read, was I began to see that there are these two strains of thinking, and one of them is very consistent with Lutheran theology, but it's not something that I'm saying, well, Orthodoxy teaches this and I can kind of squeeze it into a Lutheran system. That's not what I'm saying at all.
Right.
What I'm saying is this is just Catholic Orthodox teaching in the Church Fathers. And if we want to say that Lutheranism is Catholic and is consistent with the Fathers, there has to be theosis. Because if we're going to say that there's no theosis in Lutheranism, but there is in Orthodoxy, is essentially to give the Orthodox the Church Fathers.
Yeah.
And to say they're the Orthodox Catholic Church. Because that strain of thinking that we call theosis, for better or worse, that's the label that it's been given. Okay, so get rid of the label. I really don't care what label you want to give it, but it's just the word that's been used. Divinization, theosis, whatever you want to call it. But it's there from the beginning of the church. It's there in our most influential works. It's in Against Heresies by Irenaeus. It's in, On the Incarnation of the Word. It's in the mystical writings that are the most influential upon Luther. It's in the Theologia Germanica, which is, Luther cites as his most influential book upon his own thought. It's all over the place in St. Augustine. So to cut yourself off from theosis is not just to not be Eastern Orthodox, but it's just to not be Catholic or historically Christian, in light of how Christians have always seen the incarnation as accomplishing something real for us. So it's not taking orthodoxy. And like I said, I saw this theme of union with Christ in Luther and in the Church Fathers before I had even studied orthodoxy. I didn't start reading Eastern Orthodox sources and say, I want to bring that into Lutheranism. I just saw it in the Fathers and in Luther and in these other thinkers. And then when I read Orthodoxy, it was like, okay, yeah, they have some of these ideas too, but they take it in a different direction.
Right. Yeah. So I think maybe we could get into some more of what the book is, because we talked a little bit about what Christification was doing, but your new book, Union with Christ, so basically what you do is you take kind of the section about Lutheranism.
Yes.
And you're really delving into that. So who are some of the key players that you talk about in this book?
Yeah, so if you read Christification, there's just like a chapter that's like, oh, does this make sense with the Lutheran confessions? I talk about, Luther and the confessions and, Haneke and just some figures. It's like very brief overview. And the intention was always that I would get in depth with the Lutheran thinkers.
Right. So who are some of the key people that you cite, that you talk about?
So I cite a lot of people within Lutheranism. I don't focus on Luther, okay, because, and I purposely don't focus on Luther. I'm not a Luther scholar. That doesn't mean I haven't read a lot of Luther and don't do work in Luther. But their Luther scholarship is very convoluted. It's very debated. And there are plenty of people that are Luther scholars. I also don't read German, so I can't be a Luther scholar. I mean, I could be if I learned German. But the point is, I want to work not with the German Luther texts, but with the Latin scholastic texts and with the American Lutheran scholastic tradition as well. Because there's so much debate about Luther, and what I'm really trying to do in a lot of my books is move Lutheranism not away from Luther as if he's like not important, but away from just narrow emphasis on Luther, to say like, all right, just leave the Luther question alone, right? Let's just like leave the question of the Finns and Luther alone. I do deal with the Finns there, but I'm more asking like, okay, so regardless of Luther and like how you take his language and the influence of mystics in his thought and all of that stuff, which again I do mention, but it's not going to be the focus. Mm-hmm. I want to say, what has the Lutheran tradition done with this? So like, regardless of Luther, what happens after him? What do the confessions say? What do the major thinkers in our tradition say? So from there, I look at a number of thinkers. The two most primary are always going to be Chemnitz and Gerhard. And there's a saying that there are three in a line of Lutheran theologians of whom there is no fourth: Luther, Chemnitz, and Gerhard. And that saying is I think very well stated, that these are the three foundational theologians of our tradition. Not that there aren't others that are influential and important as well, but if you want to look at the major figures that kind of are the major stream of Lutheran orthodoxy post Luther, you're going to look at those two, Chemnitz and Gerhard. So I look at Chemnitz and Gerhard. That includes Chemnitz on the two natures of Christ. I deal with Gerhard both in his dogmatic and his devotional works. That's
something else I want to talk about later.
Yes, we can get into that too. And I show that he uses this kind of language in both of those kind of works. Chemnitz absolutely uses it. But I don't just stay there. I do deal with. Who else do I deal with? I cite,
Marquardt's in there.
Yes, I do deal with Kurt Marquardt and his interpretation. For a modern voice, he's great. I have some stuff with David J. Weber interacting with his article, talking about how the mystical union is a very prominent Lutheran theme in a lot of American Lutheran foundational figures. That's a great essay too that I recommend. I think it's available online for free too. You can look that up. And so is Marquardt's, actually. You can read both of those for free. Gifford Grobian's another modern Lutheran writer who's done some great work on this topic. But then I also deal with people like C.F.W. Walther, and I show that this theme is in his preaching. And I try to show that union with Christ it's in our dogmatics textbooks, it's in our devotional works, it's in our preaching and practical theology.
It's also in our hymnody, and I'm sad that there isn't a chapter on that.
Yes.
I said this when he wrote it.
I did think about that, and it was just...
I gave him junk about it already.
She did, so. and you could do so much with the music.
Yeah.
Lutheran hymnody is just not an area that I am... It would take a lot more research.
Yeah.
And I just...
That would be a great article, though.
It would be a wonderful article. So, hey, anybody watching want to do something on Lutheran hymnody, because it absolutely is there. But also, as I said, I don't speak German, and a lot of the hymnody is in German, so I would need some help with translation work and things like that. So, that also. Someone who knows German very well, go write an article on it. It would be great. We'll publish it in one of our books or something. No, really, that is...
Always be plugging.
She's right. I know, right? That is an element that's missing. Like, that is an element that would be really helpful to look at, too.
But my point is just to round out the discussion by saying it's also... Even in, like, the stuff that we teach our kids, like, we're singing The Church is One Foundation today in church. Yeah. And, the kids are singing, Yet She on Earth Hath Union.
I mean, that was written by an Anglican, though, so I'm not sure it counts.
I'm just saying. But it is in the faith life and the practice of the church.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Which is fun to think about, too, because it's not just some... I feel like there is a difference between how a lot of people kind of consume academic theology.
Yes.
And, the practical, on the boots on the ground kind of theology.
And that's why I thought it was so important to go into devotional literature and preaching.
Exactly.
And I look at commentaries, too, for another thing. It's like, how do they read the text? Like, what do they say?
You've got Kretzmann in there, too.
Yeah, right? I've got Kretzmann, and I have the Lutheran Commentary series that we publish.
Yeah.
I just to give a breadth, I look at Philippi's commentary. I look at Lenski. Olshausen was another one. I just look at a breadth of sources that talk about union and just say, like, well, how did just Lutheran commentators, how do they look at it?
Yeah.
And so historically, the point is, I'm looking from not just like one figure, right? This is a theme that is in every aspect of Lutheran faith and life and theology from writers across the centuries. And I mean, we can go and say it's in the Church Fathers, and because we do consider ourselves part of the Catholic tradition, like going back to the Fathers. So we could talk more about specific works, but those are some of the thinkers I deal with. I know I also deal with Widener. I looked at Hollatz a bit, David Hollatz from the Scholastic era. I know someone recommended I look at Kalov, which I did a little bit. The reason I chose to focus on Hollatz was purposeful, though, because he is kind of the last figure of the Scholastic era, the era of Lutheran Orthodoxy. So he ends up being the kind of consummation or the summary of a lot of the findings that have already happened. So I thought he would be the most useful to look at.
Yeah.
So I look at Hollatz there a little bit and what he has to say as well.
So, but this didn't stop you from also doing some comparative theology.
Yeah, right.
You can't really put out a book and not interact with people outside of the Lutheran tradition.
Yeah,
I feel like that's kind of a priority in a lot of your writing, is to say we're not just this kind of entity unto ourselves as Lutherans, but we also kind of fit within the broader... We should be able to have those discussions with people outside of
It's true.
Lutheranism.
I know that even naming this series Protestant Scholastic Theology, I'm being a bit... I don't know.
A little more ecumenical.
Yeah, a bit ecumenical, maybe a bit provocative, I think, for Lutherans who sometimes don't want to consider themselves Protestant or Scholastic. But the point is, like, I write beyond the Lutheran tradition. That's always been part of my purpose, is to be very faithfully conventional Lutheran, but to be part of conversations outside of our tradition, because that is something that I didn't see happening when I came into Lutheranism, and I wish that it had been there at the time.
Yeah. So I think it was pretty obvious, like in Christification, we talked about how you interact with Eastern Orthodoxy, and you kind of
and that's like the point of the book.
Yeah, that is the point of the book. And so this particular book doesn't necessarily do that as much, but it does discuss Reformed ideas about union with Christ and how we agree, disagree with the Reformed tradition.
Yes.
So who are some of those people that you discuss?
Oh, yeah. So I do deal with the Reformed tradition, as you said, instead of the Orthodox tradition. That's not to say I don't cite any Eastern writers.
No, they're in there a little bit.
There's a little bit of Roman Catholic citation, and I know I use Daniel Keating a little bit. And but the Reformed get a bit of interaction there. And that's something that I've really wanted to do, just because this is part of my background. And they talk about union with Christ, and I think they're right to talk about union with Christ all the time, and the centrality of that doctrine. So,
and that's not necessarily in the Great Divide either. You're dealing with different issues in the Great Divide.
No, it's really not.
Another book you can also buy that Jordan wrote.
I think I did interact some with the union with Christ ideas in there, a little bit in the connection between justification and sanctification. Right. That's where that comes out. And that I'll have more discussion on that in my Justification Volume 2. But yeah, not extensively. So I do deal with the question of union in Reformed scholarship. And in many ways, I'm drawing a lot of parallels to say there are actually a lot of commonalities here.
Yeah, but it's interesting how, because I guess we'll get into this too, but you kind of
go ahead.
You describe union with Christ in kind of three main different ways.
Yes.
Right?
Maybe I should...
maybe we should take a step back and do that first. But I kind of wanted to know who of the Reformed people you deal with. Because I feel like this is one of the things that maybe somebody watching who's Reformed might be like, oh, I'm really interested in that guy.
Yeah, sure.
I'm interested in your approach to that guy.
So I tried to deal with ones that really actually interacted with Lutheranism.
Right.
So Lane Tipton, Michael Horton, Robert Letham actually deal with Lutheranism, which was great. So I was like, I got something to really interact with, because oftentimes they just don't interact with that perspective.
It's easier to just bash Arminians all the time.
No. And we can do that too. But so read some Pieper. He could do some good Arminian bashing, but
it's part of our heritage.
It is. Sorry to all my Arminian listeners out there, but I also deal with John Murray, though, who doesn't really interact with Lutherans in his Redemption, Accomplished, and Applied, but I think that's such a foundational text for the Reformed discussions surrounding union with Christ. So I deal with Murray, Tipton, Letham, Gaffin a little bit, and Horton are the ones I deal with in there. I may be forgetting somebody, but I believe those are the main ones.
Yeah, I know one of the questions I got online, because before these things happen, if you follow me on Twitter, you might see me tweet out something about how you can ask me questions to ask him. So if you ever see me doing that when he releases a book, you can always submit questions.
It's always fun.
Yeah, how do you differ from Gorman? That was a question that came up.
Yeah.
But that is really in Christification.
It is. So Michael Gorman, if you're not familiar with him, he's a scholar on Paul who's dealt with the question of participation and union in Paul's theology. Wonderful work. I'd highly recommend him. He has been very influential in my own reading of Paul. I would say, and I interact with him in Christification a little bit, I would say that I think Gorman very sufficiently demonstrates that Paul's theology is very strongly participatory and not only forensic. Where I would differ, and I'm trying to recall at this point the specifics of what Gorman does in terms of, because I know he doesn't deny a forensic justification altogether, but I don't remember exactly where he goes with it. But I would say that my primary issue with like the Finns and others is that they often see the participatory themes in Paul or in Luther or in the Church Fathers. And this is what I see a lot of, particularly the 20th century Orthodoxy doing as well. And then kind of just throwing out the forensic altogether, right? And saying like, oh, well, it's participation, so not forensic. And what I'm trying to say is, justification is absolutely forensic. It's the imputed righteousness of Christ, which includes his active and passive obedience. There is the, two aspects of justification, the negative taking away of or forgiving of sins, the non-imputation of sin, and then the positive imputation of righteousness. All of the traditional Reformation teaching on justification I completely affirm, and I'm saying that that's key, but I'm saying that is not to be isolated, right? That's not to be taken away. That does not to take away from the reality of the participatory union we have with Christ and the real change that occurs within us through that too. So whereas some thinkers or some exegetes are wanting to emphasize participation over the forensic categories, I'm just saying, why do we have to pick? Because there's a reason why the Christian tradition from the very beginning has always had both of these categories. And I would argue that someone like Athanasius, who is, the foundational figure in some ways for Theosis talk, also speaks about Christ's death as paying a debt, which is very much kind of legal language, forensic language, right? So like we don't have to pick. We can have it all because it's all biblical.
Right. And so I think that this gets us into the whole like three different ways you talk about union in this book. So do you want to kind of give an overview?
Yeah. So I think like the phrase union with Christ, oftentimes when I've seen conversations happen, say with a Lutheran and Reformed person, they often are talking past each other because there's no definition of what union with Christ means.
Right. And so you have very concrete ways of talking about it. So, and I think that this is probably the most helpful piece of this book, is that you divide it out into these three categories.
Yes.
And so for all of you who are kind of on the fence about like buying the book and reading it, I think that this is probably the most helpful part.
Yeah, and this is like the bulk of the book, right?
Right. So this is like the main point of the book, right?
There is background. Like the first part of the book is, I do my kind of review of what's going on in literature, where the discussions are today.
Is the chapter name?
It's just called literature review because it's I know. It's
not super imaginative
it's very thrilling, sorry, but whatever.
He's an academic writer. What do you want?
If you give it a creative title, like what the heck it is anyway. I mean, I could pretend it's something else, but it's just a literature review. So there's that in the beginning, but then I deal with the philosophical questions of why did Luther scholarship shift? I felt like that was really necessary.
That is necessary, and also something I wanted to ask you about.
Yes, but then I get into the bulk of the book is basically to say what I mean by union with Christ is these three things. Okay, so there are three elements to union with Christ.
And there are three different ways it shows up in Lutheran theology.
Yes. The place, let me tell you, the place where I see this confused most often and people talking past each other is when the Reformed say union with Christ precedes justification. And the Lutheran says, no, union with Christ is a result of justification. And they can battle back and forth. What I'm saying is they're not even talking about the same thing by union with Christ. They're actually talking about two totally different things. So let's define the terms first. Define the phrase. So what do we mean in Lutheranism by union with Christ? What do the Reformed mean by union with Christ? And then go from there. And is what the Reformed mean what someone like Osiander meant? And it's really not. So the three elements to summarize what they are. The first is what I call the objective union. And this is the foundation of union, which is the incarnation. Right? Which is to say, Jesus, like in the incarnation, the Logos unites himself to a human nature. And there is no talk of union with Christ without the foundation in Jesus' person.
Right. So you talk about like Jesus as the collective.
Yeah, and that's Monerma's phrase. In interpreting Luther, he uses this phrase of he's a collective person. So that kind of all people are encapsulated in Christ in some way, which doesn't work from a Reformed perspective. So there is going to be a difference there already in the question of the universality of the atonement. And so when we look at texts like Romans 5 and the comparison between the universality of Adam and that we're all somehow in Adam, somehow we're all in Christ in a sense, not in a saving sense of being in Christ, but somehow Christ unites himself to humanity.
Right.
Now, what we don't want to do, because I also mentioned, you can go overboard with this as well and say, well, it's just a collective thing. Like, is this just collective? There's no particularity in the incarnation. It's just this collective reality of divine and humanity coming together. Like, this is what Hegel does, and I'm saying, like, okay, that's not what we're saying. So there absolutely is a particularity to the incarnation. As Kierkegaard is gonna say to Hegel. So we're not saying that it's just like some kind of abstract universal reality. Gerhard deals with this in his Christology too, where he says, he didn't just take upon himself the genus of humanity so that we can all say, I am Christ, right? That we've all been incarnated. We're all hypostatically united to the Logos. No, like not in that sense. But it is really universal in some sense, in that what occurs in the incarnation is something beyond just its preparation for Jesus to die on the cross. Now it is, like it's necessary for him to die on the cross. But what I'm saying is there's something real happening in the incarnation itself that is necessary for our salvation. That the estrangement of God and man, now in the coming together of the Logos with humanity, that estrangement has been overcome. Now, not completely, because of course you need the cross, but that's an element of our salvation that's needed. So this idea is that Jesus unites himself, universally. Humanity is united to Jesus in some way. And I think this is very clear I talk about the doctrine of objective justification. So for those who...
That's where I was going next.
Yeah, those who affirm objective justification, you have to believe this. Because the whole point of objective justification is that all of humanity is already in him, so that when Jesus is justified, humanity is justified in him.
Right.
So this is very consistent with our theology. And you see, I cite Chemnitz and Gerhard as well, saying, exactly this. But you even see it in the development of ideas like objective justification that rely on this as a foundation. So that's going to be something that differs from the Reformed. So there's the first, what I call the objective union. And I use that purposefully, like objective justification, to say that kind of all of the benefits that we have applied to us are foundationally in the life of Christ.
Right.
Like everything is objectively in him. Like he objectively receives the Spirit before we do in his baptism. So subjectively we can. Like everything happens first, redemptive historically, in Christ. It's all Christological.
And so, I feel like this is one of the other things that I see all the time, like, well, you're just making it about your feelings, or it's not an objective reality if you talk about union. Because it's all about whether or not you're, I don't know, becoming more and more like Christ. And that's the union that people want to talk about. But I think starting with this objective union kind of proves the alien righteousness piece that is needed as the foundational piece to all of it.
I mean, the subjectivists are the people that I'm rejecting, right? I mean, the subjectivism is in the liberalism that rejected union with Christ.
Yes.
When you see someone like Albrecht Ritschl, who completely denies that there is a real union with Christ, ontologically anyway, or metaphysically, he says instead it's just a union of moral wills.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what the moralist or the subjectivist does.
Right.
No, I'm saying that there is something real and objective that occurred in Christ himself. And we actually get to share in that, which is pretty cool.
So cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the next thing is, the formal union.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So you can talk about that.
Yeah, the formal union of faith, the unio fidei formalis, which is so that particular phrase, Hallatz kind of popularizes it, I would say. Everyone seems to quote Hallatz. He's actually not the one to come up with the phrase, but he's the one that I see people citing, at least. And I haven't found it in some of the other influential sources before him. That doesn't mean it's not there, but I haven't seen it in people like Karlov and Quenched it, at least the term. Okay. Now, I would argue the concept actually exists all over the place, but which is something I try to demonstrate. But he says this, that when he's explaining the mystical union, and he does this in like a question and answer format, if you read his work is sadly untranslated. I would love to see how that's translated. But
hey, hit us up if you want to translate it.
Some Latin translation for us would be.
Yeah.
I would love to see him in English. Because it's just a summary of like everything that happened in that era. So what Hallatz says is he asks the question, when is it that the mystical union happens in the order of salvation? Like, is it a cause of justification, or does it happen as a result of justification? Now, like the Formula of Concord says in Article 3, dealing with Osiander, Osiander said that we are righteous because the righteous Jesus dwells in us. Right? So the righteousness of God is in us, changing us, and therefore we are righteous, which is opposed to the idea of an imputed righteousness, which the Formula of Concord takes as the standard Lutheran position. So in light of that, he's going to say, okay, yeah, the mystical union, Christ indwells us. We're not, I'm not justified because some indwelling righteousness changing me. I'm justified because of what Jesus did. That's true. But then Hallatz says, but if we're talking about union with Christ, he says there's another kind of union that does precede justification. It's when Jesus is apprehended by us as our mediator in faith. So that he calls this the formal union of faith. He later references it as a kind of baptismal union as well. So it's this idea that the question of why does faith justify? Well, faith justifies me because it unites me to Jesus. And if we're talking objective justification here, Jesus is the righteous one. He was declared justified at his resurrection. And why does faith justify me? It's not because of something subjectively, individually happening inside me, but I am justified because I am united to Jesus, and as I am united to him, I'm united to his merit, and I'm united to his work, which means that all that he has becomes mine.
This is the Great Exchange
section. Which is
section.
also the whole Great Exchange formula, right? So the Great Exchange formula is, I am married to Christ, therefore he gives me his righteousness.
Right.
That's the whole Great Exchange in Luther. Well,
and he gets all of our sin.
I mean, the whole metaphor doesn't work if union comes after justification, because the whole point is I have his righteousness because I'm united to him, and this is the faith union that Hallatz is talking about here. So it's this that the Reformed are really grabbing onto when they're talking about union with Christ preceding justification. They're not talking about the mystical union that, and sometimes they will use a phrase mystical union, but they don't mean the same thing. So John Murray, for example, calls it a mystical union, but he explains what that means, and he says it's mystical because it's a mystery. Right. Well, for the Lutherans, mystical union is something beyond that. It is a mystery, but the mystical union is about they can even speak of a kind of interpenetration of the nature of God and the nature of man together. He mystically indwells us and changes us. So that's the kind of union that follows justification in their thought. But that's not always what the Reformed are talking about. Now, the Reformed don't always strongly distinguish those two things, and some may say that. But what the Reformed are getting at is essentially they're looking at a number of passages in Paul where he says things like, I have the righteousness of God insofar as I am in him, right? The Philippians 3, for example, 2 Corinthians 5:21, or, you have these, in him there is no condemnation. Not being condemned is justification. I am justified or not condemned because I am in Christ or in union with Christ, right? That's what he's saying. So they're looking at these texts that pretty clearly say the reason I'm justified is because I'm in Christ. And, so the question I had was, what do some Lutheran commentators say? As I mentioned, I looked at some Lutheran commentaries and said, what do they say about this? How do they treat these passages? And they all say the same thing. I mean, they recognize, of course, that's what's going on. I said, no, I'm united to Christ. I'm connected to Jesus. And that's the phrase I think that Kretzmann grabs onto a lot. Is he often uses that phrase being, I am connected to Jesus and I'm justified because I'm connected to Jesus. Well, that's all that the Reformed mean often when they're talking about union with Christ. So that you have to be connected to Jesus to have his righteousness, right? So that it's not necessarily talking about the mystical indwelling. So I'm saying that, just logically, it's because I am united with his person that I have justification. It's not, and this is the kind of caricature that you get in someone like N.T. Wright. He's got this famous phrase. This is in his earlier work as well, but in his earlier work, he had this famous phrase where he says, your righteousness is not some kind of substance or gas that can be passed around in a courtroom. It's as if, like, Jesus takes his righteousness away from his person and is like, here's an attribute of me, you can have some. Pass it around, give it to the defendant or something. But, I mean, that completely misunderstands what's going on. It's because I'm united to Jesus himself that I have what is his. So I'm trying to demonstrate that that's there, and it's there in the Sacred Meditations of Gerhard, for example. He's very clear in a couple points that, we're united to Jesus first, and then we get his righteousness. So generally when they use the phrase union, they're talking about the mystical union. But there are times where they clearly recognize this other reality too, and Hollatz is just the first one to kind of explicitly say, like, there's also this other kind of union.
He came up with the category to describe
the thing. Right. But the thing's been there the whole time. And this is what good development of theology does, right? Doesn't create theology from nowhere, but it brings precision, it brings categories. I would say the same about Luther's doctrine of justification. I don't think it came from nowhere. I think he's grabbing onto all of these themes in the earlier church and even in the medieval period. And he's just kind of putting all the pieces together. And that's similar to what, Hollatz is doing. It's been there. Of course it's been there. And, I think it's noteworthy, too, that when you have people like Heinrich Schmid or Francis Pieper or others that cite, Henry Esther Jacobs does as well, they cite Hollatz and mention that he makes this distinction. None of them are like, oh, and that's a bad distinction. Like, they all just affirm it. They cite it and like, okay, well, there's also this other way of talking. Even if they don't talk about it a lot, they recognize, like, yeah, that's a thing, too. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. So anyway, that's the formal union of faith. In that chapter, I also delve a bit into the question of the Great Exchange and looking at how that relates to this question as well. And it's such a helpful category for so many reasons. The Great Exchange, and it's something I appreciated a lot about, and I'll write about this more in my Justification volume, but Michael Horton's treatment of justification in his 2-volume work is that he relies on this Great Exchange to say, like, here's really where in the Fathers you have this tie between them and the doctrine of justification. And what I think the Great Exchange does so well is it gives you this formula to say, this is where all of the forensic and all of the participation and all of this stuff fits into this one overall schema, which is an exchange, which is I get what is Jesus's and he gets what is mine. And that's forensic, that's participatory, that includes, that formula really just brings everything, I think, together in a really concise and beautiful way.
This is like my favorite thing to talk about.
No, it's great.
Yeah.
It's great.
Good stuff. So the third and final, I guess, category that you bring out is the mystical union. And I think this might be like the hot button piece. This is the part that, like, a lot of people have kind of been skeptical of. Yeah,
and so the mystical union, and this is usually what Lutherans mean when they talk about union with Christ. Generally, it's the mystical union. So this is the most common part of union with Christ. And this is really what I dealt with in Christification. Now, this chapter was not heavily exegetical, purposefully. Some of the exegetical work was done in Christification. It'd be great maybe someday I'll write a whole book on the biblical theological
we were just talking about this
background of this. I know.
And I was just telling him to do it. So.
I had all these ideas when I wrote this book. I'm like, I'm going to do a chapter. I'm going to go through like Meredith Kline and how he speaks about the divine glory and like connect that with Theosis. And, like I would love to do that, but I'm like, it's just too much for this book. So maybe eventually. But
yeah, it's beyond. I mean, this is pretty long. It's pretty hefty.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah.
At some point, you have to kind of narrow your thought process.
Union with Christ is really my favorite topic, so this is something I could I could write only about this, and I'd be very happy. So, oh man, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so it's not like a primarily exegetical chapter, because I think what I really needed to demonstrate is that this is Lutheran. Like, I wanted to show this is in the Lutheran sources. It's in like all of the Lutheran sources. It's everywhere. It's not just in one place. It's not just one misquote of somebody. It's not just like a mistranslation. In fact, what I find interesting is some of the... So there are like three different translations. I believe three different translations of the Sacred Meditations by Johann Arndt. And
so good.
Which
if
is
you haven't
wonderful.
read that, buy it and read it.
Yeah, and we
so
sell a version of it.
Yes, it's delightful.
There are three different translations, and I worked with two of the English translations. One is the older one that we had, and there's Wade Johnston's, and I looked at the Latin text as well. And why I bring that up is to say that sometimes people will be like, oh, well, it's just a bad translation that wants it to say, this or that thing. I purposefully, I did this in Prolegomena too, but people didn't kind of realize what I was doing. I purposefully used a translation that was the translation of somebody who has written negative reviews of my books, specifically on union with Christ. Because I'm like, this is a critic of my view of this, translating Gerhard. So I think it is even more powerful to say, like, even they have to recognize what he says, which is that he speaks about us becoming divine, like numerous times in that book. Mm-hmm. He says that we partake of the divine in the Eucharist, and through that we become divine. And that kind of language of divinization, becoming divine, like, that is theosis. Like, that's definitional theosis. And I would, of course, just say, like, that's just Peter, right? Peter says we partake of the divine nature. So the question should never be for a Christian, is theosis real or not? But what is theosis? What kind of theosis is true? It's like, to say that there's no theosis is kind of like saying, well, do you believe in predestination or not? Well, I hope you do, because it's biblical, like the terms
right.
in the Bible. So, like, no, we share in the divine nature. Like, that, there should be no debate there. That's theosis, is sharing in the divine nature. So the question is, if there's this divinization, what is it? Okay, that's the question. Not is it real or not, but what is it? So Gerhard commonly uses this kind of language in the Sacred Meditations. And then I go through... I talk about Johann Arndt, who I know is a bit of a controversial figure, but union is really the center of his devotional work. He was he mentored Gerhard. So he was a big influence on Gerhard. And I dealt with Arndt, and I know people are going to probably cite that and say, oh, you're just... but the pietists loved Arndt, and this is proof that you're a pietist because you cite him. Well, I know he's controversial, but he also is like the most significant figure in terms of Lutheran devotional writing. So you got to look at what he says. You can disagree with him, but know that this is common parlance among those who are like the most popular Lutheran devotional work at the time of orthodoxy. But then I also show, it's not just in Arndt and Gerhard, these devotional writers. I then, go through some of the scholastics and just talk about what is the mystical union? Like, what does this mean? They speak of partaking of the divine life. They speak about the interpenetration of natures. I deal with Hollatz, I deal with Heinecke, who's a 19th century Wells theologian. I deal with Heinrich Schmid. I deal with Conrad Lindbergh. I mean, there are names from across the centuries. And eventually I get to C.F.W. Walther. And
gotta love Walther.
yeah, and I mean, like, I've got plenty to complain about with Walther, but don't we all, right? I can complain about Walther's ecclesiology all day, but we'll leave that alone. Anyway, his sermons. I looked at some of his sermons, and particularly I was looking at sermons that dealt with this question of union with Christ. And I think Walther's such a significant figure because if there's anyone who was very clearly uncompromising in their confessionalism, it's Walther, right? I mean, he is so ready to cut off fellowship with anyone who disagrees on any point of an interpretation of anything.
Yes.
Like, that's just Walther. That he's very, I mean, he's like the doctrinally strict.
It's a little spicy.
He is a little spicy. He's a little, yeah.
Yeah.
That's just Walther. Like,
yeah.
That's... I don't know if he'd be the nicest guy to hang out with, but at least maybe if you agree with him on everything. But but the point is, like, he's very hard-headed. He's, of course I love Walther, and he's, got wonderful pastoral insight and theological insight. But, we're picking on him a little bit. But
it's out of love. So
he's not the kind of guy going to be like, oh, he's just a crypto Eastern Orthodox dude. No, but if you read his sermons, he preaches this. Like, he preaches union. And it's not a side comment, right? It's not just like, oh, by the way, we affirm it, but whatever. Like, he preaches entire sermons on union with Christ. And he preaches about the renewal of the Imago Dei that the Spirit brings about in us, changing us, making us more like him. And he, will say things like, God became man that man might become like God. Multiple times he uses these kinds of phrases, which is, of course, like coming from Athanasius. He doesn't anywhere say like, oh, this is Athanasius. And he doesn't, say it in exactly the same way. But the point is, the same idea is there. Like, at another point he says, he made us, God's Son became a man that we might become sons of God. He uses that. So clearly, like, this is what we mean by theosis. This is what Athanasius meant. And he spoke about this, the indwelling that changes us. And, we're talking here about the guy who wrote the book on law and gospel, right? This is not a compromiser, confuser of law and gospel. He wrote the famous book that everybody wants to quote all the time, who, wants to say that this precludes any talk of sanctification or anything. And I mean, Walther's a harsh sanctification preacher. If you want to read some
yikes
preaching on sanctification, he's a lot more blunt and harsh than I would ever be in my sermons. I mean, he's
intense.
He's very intense.
He's worth reading, for sure.
Yeah, it just shows you that
Yeah.
There's really a total misunderstanding of Walther's Law and Gospel in this reductionistic way that it's been read.
That's the thing. Because if you reduce him to only that point, you're missing so much.
And you're clearly misunderstanding him in the way he talks about preaching and the Christian life if none of his preaching looks like your interpretation of Walther.
You gotta read his pastoral theology. That's where you really get how he thinks you should be preaching and how he thinks, you should conduct yourself as a Christian and as a minister. I think he has some very interesting insight. And if you were to take him at his word in those ways, all of the other stuff kind of, I don't know, fits better into the paradigm.
Yeah,
what CFW
and he
Walther
doesn't
would
say there that the goal of the sermon is to kill and make alive, and that the law and the gospel are speech acts of God, and that the sermon should be 5 minutes because it's just an absolution. He says that the sermon should be no more than 3/4 of an hour, and that you better be lecturing on theology and catechesis. So, I mean,
he also has 5 different elements that need to be required in a sermon.
Yeah, and
they're not all law and gospel.
Oh no, rebuking false doctrine is in there, and
sanctification, exhorting to holiness is in there too.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Yeah.
He's so misread by a very. He's misread through the lens of Ehlert's law-gospel distinction, which had influenced at both Concordia seminaries in the mid-20th century. So, anyway, the point of all this is just to say the mystical union has been a key part of Lutheran theology, and it always has been. And if you go from, pre-Luther, go to the Theologia Germanica and Johann Tauler and Bernard of Clairvaux, the biggest influences on Luther, their theology is all union with Christ. And then go to Luther and read what he says in light of all of his influences, and it's very obvious. And then read everyone following after Luther in the Scholastic tradition. And yes, the Pietists, they also talk about union with Christ, but they didn't get it from nowhere. And then going into the confessional revival of the 19th century, into the beginning of the 20th century, all the way to 1930 when you hit Joseph Stump's The Christian Faith, which is a wonderful section on union with Christ, the mystical union, which is kind of the last great book of that era, of the revival of confessionalism. Then you have a lot of other theological influences kind of taking control. You have neo-orthodoxy and all sorts of other things, and all of a sudden union with Christ is lost. So what do you want to do? Stick with a bunch of, 20th century liberal theologians, or the rest of the Christian tradition? There you go.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm being spicy here, but
it's okay. good. Read the book. It's fun.
Yeah. Anything else you want to ask before we close? I mean, I know we're at an hour here, but
so
if there's anything you feel like
I always like to take a step back and ask more like kind of behind the scenes things, because that's you can get what he says in the book from the book, right? Someone had asked about how you design your covers, who does that, all of the design work on the books. I think that this is like something that people may not know. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know someone asked about that. So this is part of our, publishing house. This is something an initiative that we have with the Widener Institute specifically is to publish original academic works. Now, it's not like it's just going to be my books or something. That was never the goal. There are a few cool things coming up. We have a lot of great things coming up, and we want to expand a lot. I never wanted this organization to be all about me, for sure. So one of those is in September, we've got the book of essays. And I have one essay in there, but we've got a number of other authors as well. And that's on essays on justification. Yeah. You think it's good? Yeah. Okay. Well, you've got her recommendation, so it's got to be good. So this is something we've wanted to do, is delve into publishing new more academic works within Lutheran theology, kind of moving beyond the republications with Justice Center Publishing. But we also have some practical volumes coming out through that as well that are original works from others. Anyway, so as I've moved into this position in doing this as my regular job, I mean, this is my main source of income here through Justice Center, which is why I need you to donate. So it is helpful. And we are hiring an editor, hopefully, as well, so we'll have some help. But as of right now, I mean, I do everything myself, which means, I design the covers. I do everything related to, like, everything, like the website, the typesetting and all of that kind of stuff. And I have different resources that I use to help with those things. In terms of how I design the covers, I can tell you a couple things that I do. One is, I do use some templates and change them some, but at least for the cover portion, not for the back or the side. Those I just design myself. But generally, I've used images that are public domain images on here for some kind of artwork because they're public domain. You don't have to pay for them, so that's good. But I put work into, making series consistent with each other. Like the back and stuff I designed totally myself, including the fonts and everything else. But it won't say not for resale on your copy. I won't say that. This is the proof copy I have here. But I do all of that. It's always the goal that our stuff looks nice. And that's something I've been able to do since I've been able to give this more attention, is look at the aesthetics and try to have a book that, the typesetting looks good, the cover beauty looks matters. Nice. Beauty matters. If you've listened to my program on beauty, or read my next book. So so this is book number 9, which I think is really exciting. Next one is going to be 10. We're going to have a party. Yeah, it's going to be sweet. The kids keep saying they want a party. We're going to throw a party. It's going to be great. They kept asking about this. They're like, is this the Truth, Goodness, and Beauty book? I'm like, no, it's a different one. They're like, oh, that's boring. No, they're really proud of you. They're very excited. I know. They just wanted to celebrate the number. They wanted to be in this discussion today. They asked if they could be. But they have not read the book, so they couldn't come. Yeah, they have tried to read some of it. So, but so the next one is my book on Truth, Goodness, and Beauty, which is a very different kind of thing. It's also not in the series. No, that's totally unrelated. That's not totally unrelated, but mostly unrelated. It's not part of this series. Anyway, that was kind of a break from this. This is kind of a heavy, lot of work series. I don't know. So right now I'm working on the Doctrine of God and the Justification one. Yeah. One more question. Yeah. How do you write so many books? How does that happen? She just writes them for me and I put my name on them. No, that's not. You weren't going to stop me. You'll just take credit. I'll take it. No. I do help him with some things. Yeah. This is, but right now, not writing his books. This is a large portion of my job is writing. This is what I hope to spend a lot of my time doing, is researching for podcasts, podcasting, teaching courses, republishing old books, and all of that goes into my writing because as you're reading a book, you can
Yes.
take things and put it into, the projects you're working on.
And the same thing with like the things I research for podcasts also ends up being stuff I can use for books, or the things that I research for books also ends up being useful in podcasts. And so it all kind of impacts, it all like works together. So I generally, though, I have like one day of the week that I set aside just for writing.
Yep.
Don't do anything else. And that's where most of the writing happens. The rest of it is, stuff that I read and other things, research. Is that it? Do you have any other questions that you got that I didn't answer from people on Twitter?
Not that I saw, but I probably got some after I looked.
Yeah,
so
it's
sorry
okay.
if we missed anything.
Too late.
It is late, and we've been doing other things, so I'm sorry I didn't catch everything. Yeah.
All right. Well, if you want to pick up a copy of the book, you can go to jspublishing.org, which is our publishing house. You can pick up all sorts of things there. You can see what else we put out. But right on the front page, at least while we're releasing this, that's the first thing you see. It's also the first thing you see at justincenter.org right now, too. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Good stuff.
Pick it up. You can get it in ebook. We have it in Kindle format. It's going to also be in EPUB format if you have a Nook, which is what I use, actually. But or some other e-reader. So that should be up. It will be up soon. I don't know if it'll be up by the time this is up, but not long after.
Yeah. So.
And maybe audiobook. People want that, but I don't know. Maybe.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
Audible takes too much money, so I don't know if I'll do that.
Hey, it might work out. There might be ways we can make it happen.
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah. Thank you for coming back.
Yeah. Anytime. This is fun.
And thanks everybody for watching and or listening. And
subscribe.
Subscribe on YouTube and your podcast
Yeah.
app. You could do both. You could listen to the podcast and watch it at the same time from two different devices. I don't know why you would do that, but you could.
The syncing issues would be insane.
Yeah, sounds fun.
Yeah. So
All right.
thanks.
We'll see you next time. God
Bye.
bless.